Welcome everybody to this evening's PROMS-G presentation by Patrick Mayfield. Will AI make me redundant? That's a fairly provocative title, and I'm sure Patrick will explain as he goes along. Patrick's spoken to us several times in the past, and he's always well worth listening to, so I'm looking forward to it this evening, as I hope most of you will be. He'll carry out a few audience polls, and I'm going to do one just at the beginning to find out how many people are currently involved in AI or have been involved in AI in the past. And also he'll pose some questions near the end, and a wash-up session will be responding to various comments that you make, and Amit and myself will pose those comments to Patrick during that period. But just before I hand over to Patrick, I just want to advertise a couple of events that are upcoming. On the 29th of April, there's a joint event with South Yorkshire branch. It's a repeat of a facilitated workshop that we had some while back, which was very popular, on the stakeholder conversations of leadership. And then on the 19th of May, we have a presentation on gardeners, not mechanics, how to cultivate change, project perspective. Now that should be quite interesting as well. So please do sign up for those. Right, now what I need to do is, oh, where is it? Polls, that's right. I'm just going to release a poll. Hang on a sec. Right, so here's the question, everybody. So if you'd like to answer that for us, and then I'll close it down, and Patrick may be interested in seeing what results come up. So just 60% of you have voted so far. I'll just leave it open for a little bit longer. Not too hard a question to start off with. Are any more of you going to vote? It's up to 70% now. 74. Come on, you're doing well. Right, I think I'll close it there. It's 83, 87. Oh, right, that's nearly all of you. I'll just close it now. Share. Right. So there are the answers, Patrick.
Yeah, that's good.
We'll both hand over to Patrick now, and look forward to hearing from you, Patrick.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your generous introduction. And I have to say, those two events that you mentioned are very interesting to me.
I'll disappear now.
Okay.
Good. Over to you.
Right. Can everybody hear me okay? One of our greatest living chess players is this guy, Garry Kasparov. This is him aged 22, when Kasparov became the youngest world chess champion in 1985, defeating the then champion Anatoly Karpov. But it was only 12 years later, in 1997, that he achieved another not so desirable first. He became the first world chess champion to be defeated by a computer, IBM's Deep Blue. You probably heard of that story. I remember being old enough to thinking at the time, I'm not at all surprised. It was only a matter of time. And then a second thought, it's only a matter of time before we're all overtaken by computers. And that surprised me a little. 11 months ago, OpenAI launched a new AI program called GPT-3. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. GPT-3 was trained on hundreds of billions of words and is capable of coding, according to Wikipedia, in CSS, JSX, and Python, among others. And some of its current applications include AI Writer, which allows people to correspond with historical figures via email. The Guardian used it to write an article about AI being harmless to human beings. It fed some ideas into GPT-3, and the program produced 8 different essays, which were ultimately merged into an article. In AI Dungeon, which generates text-based adventure games, occasionally I listen to a podcast called Tinkered Thinking. Recently, the author confessed to deciding to cede the scripting as well as the voice generation to an AI program to generate his audio recordings. Personally, as an author, I spend most of my time obviously writing. Now I'm wondering, will generations of GPT after GPT-3 make me redundant? So before I go much further, I'd like to ask you another question, another poll, and it's this. Can you see that? With advances in AI, how do you feel about your future career? And there's a range of responses there, from very pessimistic to very optimistic. So if you can vote now, please. We've got about an 86% vote rate here. I'm going to close the vote at that, close the poll at that, and share the results. So I'm really glad that we haven't got any neurotics here who are very anxious, but it's interesting that I suppose the median is between neutral and mildly optimistic. I would be interested in the Q&A afterwards, the discussion, if we can have a discussion, why you feel that way. But I'll give you a clue now. I'm feeling very much in that zone myself. I'm feeling mildly optimistic. Here's my view. My feeling is that the future will belong to some of us, not to machines. However, AI will shape our future. But if it's not AI, who or what does the future belong to? My rider question is, what if you could become one of those to whom the future belonged? In the next few minutes, I want to look first at what might be behind the fears among us. I want to look at some clues for us against the advance of machines and leave you with a hope and a challenge. But first, let's have a look at the fears. Let's have a look at some of the worries that people really have behind this. It comes down to this: what informs our perception of the future? Socrates, 2,600 years ago, said this: we are what we think about all day long. Before him, King Solomon said something like, out of the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. More recently, clinical neurologists like Caroline Leaf have said that what we focus upon begins to shape not just our thinking, but the very shape of our brains, neuroplasticity. I want to choose one part of our culture that plays a major part in informing our imagination of the future. Let's look at the stories we immerse ourselves in to be entertained, particularly movies. And this goes back nearly 100 years to a movie called Metropolis, released in 1927. And it engrossed early audiences, gripping them. But it was ultimately a dystopian story. It's now regarded as one of the most influential movies ever made. In my own generation, this one made a profound impact on me as a teenager. Stanley Kubrick's 1968 movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the onboard computer decided the astronauts were the greatest risk to the success of the mission, so decided to eliminate them. My all-time favorite was this one, the original Blade Runner movie, where androids became a near and present danger to humans. And of course, we have Terminator, where Arnie said, "I'll be back." And of course, he was as good as his word over several more movies. I could go on with similar examples of more recent movies, but the theme that emerges throughout is that Frankensteinian one where what we create ultimately destroys us. But why? Why is it that most sci-fi is so negative about humans in the future? Why is AI invariably presented as a threat to humans? I think part of the answer is there are deeply held myths in our culture, going back to myths like the Tower of Babylon. But today, part of the answer is that it simply grabs our attention. It grabs and keeps our attention around a gripping narrative. It connects with some pretty primal motivations in each of us, upon which the attention economy is now built. But is it reality? Or the narratives we use to interpret that reality? Threat gets our attention, and fear is a powerful motivator in selling newspapers, movies, and keeping us watching news channels that lead us to have a very negative view of the world and its future. The world, particularly the future for us, becomes what we meditate upon all the time. And if Socrates was right, we will become more fearful of what the future might hold. However, as the world around us moves from the complicated to the complex to the chaotic, our ability to assess actual risk becomes really quite poor. There's been a growing body of knowledge of this recently around certain biases. Daniel Kahneman wrote his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and identified several of them. The negativity bias, of course, sunk cost bias, and several others. The confirmation bias, which is an important one. Let me illustrate this with some research a few years ago among Americans. And they were asked, which is more dangerous? Being attacked by a shark or a deer? Jaws or Bambi? Well, of course, everybody went for Jaws, or most people did. They'd much rather avoid the great white shark. In fact, we might even be willing to pay to encounter a deer in the woods, wouldn't we? Yet more than 200 times more Americans were killed each year in a deer strike, pre-lockdown of course, for everyone who would be attacked and killed by a shark. So quite apart from the rational considerations of AI, it appears we're not very good at objectively assessing the future, risks in the future, and from my own background, dealing with change. All of this brings to this debate some deeply entrenched myths about the future, not least from our own entertainment industry, and our perception of risk being deeply flawed. Now then, should we proceed with the growing power of AI? let's turn to examining some important clues about our role in the advance of AI. Ultimately, this is an identity question. Are we to become pawns of the machine, as the myths tell us we will, or will we become and remain powerful? I've shared in this forum in the past about some research we did called the Crib Sheet research, our inquiry into what high-performing program and project managers actually worked to. At the time, we operated a consultancy and training business, and we were in the business of training people in various methodologies. And we were interested to see whether the high performers followed these methodologies or not. Well, first of all, could we identify high performers? Well, through peer group review, 360-degree review, we were able to, out of our research population, identify a small subset that we identified as high performers. In fact, a lot of this originated from the work of Andy Crow, who came up with a book titled The Alpha Project Manager. We didn't like that title. We came up with another one. We came up with the title Positive Outliers. So we began to interview this subgroup, the high-performing program and project managers, the positive outliers. And we asked them what their priority was, what their mental checklist, their mental crib sheet was. So I'm going to give you another poll, and I'm going to launch this. I'm wondering if you could hazard a guess as to what was their priority, these so-called alpha project managers in our crib sheet research. Got 7% votes. This is good. 50, 60. I think this is an interesting poll that we ought to do year on year, David. I think it will change over time. Everybody at one time, 87% have voted so far. That's good. I'm going to close the poll now and show you the results, which are these. Yeah, engaging stakeholders. Do you know, you're a really great group, because this is the closest you're going to get to the results of our research. All of these positive outliers did have their internal checklists, their crib sheets, but they were all different. They were all different. So the closest is the last answer. It's not that the others were wrong. They all appeared in the positive outlier results of what their priority was. But so this is the term we landed on, positive outliers, because we saw the ability of these exceptional change leaders to become models for the rest of us in what we could do. And it looks to me like we might have a few in the webinar this evening. And when it comes to being powerful in the face of radical technological change, such as through AI, there were 3 specific behavior traits that our positive outliers all revealed that bear on this, on the advance of AI and its power. First, these positive outliers all showed a high degree of self-awareness, what psychologists often call self-efficacy. They were used to thinking about their thinking. They would take action and then reflect. And if the results that they got from that action weren't quite right, they would go back and puzzle over it. And there also would be confirmation feedback loops. As we'll see later, this is a high order human faculty. The next were that they were self-led. The majority were looking for external sources of authority to tell them what to do, but the positive outliers chose what they attended to next. They ordered their own private world. They were not reacting to the external world expecting others to give them their agenda. These people were self-led, or at least they carved out huge portions of their week where they had the freedom to do so. But the final behavior that these positive outliers demonstrated again and again, which the control group didn't, was what has been called a bias to action, which we called a leaning to action. Because of their self-awareness, these positive outliers never threw themselves into reckless action. They never said, oh, just got to do something, like throwing everything up in the air and hoping it would work. But they took small steps based on reflection. These are now called safe to fail actions. I like that phrase. These safe to fail actions produce more learning, sometimes in quite chaotic contexts. Now, some of you may know of the Cynefin framework of Dave Snowden. I'm a great admirer of his work. If you know about his model, it's got simple problems, complicated, complex, and then chaotic, where there don't seem to be any rules that emerge, or if there are things, they're extremely well hidden. And Snowden would argue that one of the best or only ways to navigate chaos is through small steps of safe to fail action and then learn from each of them. These people always acted into their work, and they were never waiting for others higher up to tell them what to do. Yet, we are complex creatures, and we do not fully understand ourselves. I've been accessing some of the research around sleep and rest, and it's clear that we know very little about what we're doing when we're resting, but sometimes there's neurological evidence to suggest that our brains are even more active than when we're consciously working on something. With that in mind, cognitive psychologists generally believe that our sense-making of this world is made up of, yes, the object empirical reality, but also that narrative we use to interpret that reality, that we overlay on the objective world. Now, we like to think in the West that we're rationalists. We like to think, yeah, we operate on the basis of evidence. But I'd suggest to you tonight that our narrative thinking is much larger than we'd like to think. It's pretty subjective, it's pretty emotional, and at times ideological. I mean, take, for example, the COVID-19 debate around lockdown and vaccines. Seems to me that people are more informed by their frustrations, by their ideologies, than they are about the science. And I suggest that the set of narratives we bring to take on and even have a bigger role when we look at using AI into the future matters greatly. Otherwise, we can carry on believing that there are monsters under the bed all the time. What we perceive may only be partial truth. Some may see a circle, but from a different perspective, others see a triangle, when a larger perspective might mean that what they're seeing is actually something like a cone. And this happens more often than we realize. We think of science as progressing cumulatively, linearly, and rationally. In the 1960s, there was a seminal work published by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And it deserves more reference than it gets these days. As a sociologist, he observed the progress of science, and he found it to be neither linear nor rational. Peer group pressure in the scientific community and the prevailing paradigms, and he came up with this reference in this context of the word paradigm and paradigm shift. He meant that the prevailing scientific paradigms meant that prevailing hypotheses and explanations of our objective reality remained long past their obsolescence. If you propose a new theory, a radically new theory that explains rather more of the discarded evidence that doesn't fit the confirmation bias of the scientific community, the establishment might not publish it. You might not get it into peer group review publications, and it could ruin your career to boot. Here's an example from recent history. Meet Hungarian medical physician and scientist Ignaz Semmelweis. This is him in 1860, when he was 42. And at the time, he was working in Vienna General Hospital. At the time, there was a worrying high mortality rate among postnatal women. There's something called puerperal fever caused by streptococcal infection. It was more commonly known as bed fever. Mortality rates were noticeably higher than among poor women who had their kids at home. And even more noticeably, there were two clinics. Mortality rates were also higher among patients in the first clinic, which puzzlingly was led by the senior physicians for teaching medical students, than in the second clinic for teaching midwives. The known frontier of medical science at the time, we might call it these days the shiny new object, was doing autopsies. It was all the rage in medical science in the mid-1800s. And senior physicians would do autopsies in the morning, and in the afternoon would examine the wounds of their female patients, often without washing their hands. Because there was no germ theory then of contagion. It was all thought to be vapors and humors and so forth. Semmelweis was very unhappy about this. He progressively tried control tests of eliminating certain practices in his clinic to see if it improved the women's survival rates. But after noticing the death of a friend from septic shock after a student accidentally stabbed his finger with a scalpel after such an autopsy, Semmelweis began starting to institute rigorous hand washing with chlorine before examinations of the women. This was the result. He was one of the earliest physicians to land on germ theory as an explanation for infections such as puerperal fever. However, the medical establishment in the hospital vigorously disputed his germ theory, treating it as personal criticism of themselves. And they were of a higher status than he was. In those days, the longer your gown meant the more senior you were, and Semmelweis wasn't that senior. They exhibited what psychologists call belief persistence. They made working there intolerable for Semmelweis. He degenerated into a form of anxiety-induced dementia, eventually left, and was later lured into an insane asylum in 1865, wherein within weeks he, ironically, died of a gangrenous infection. The tragedy is that shortly afterwards, the physicians began to take germ theory seriously, began through hand washing, and saw mortality rates plummet. Now, this is relevant to whenever we introduce radically innovating AI technologies. We are dealing with irrational clients who have prevailing narratives. It also applies to our own work. We think about the work that we do, not as medics, not as factory workers, but as desk workers. It might look something like this. When office work became seriously industrialized, it had a clear hierarchy with populations similar to this triangle. There were armies of desk clerks, usually men to begin with knowledge workers being fewer and more highly paid, with some true creatives, innovators, engineers, and entrepreneurs who were the few at the top. The thing is that the philosophy of Frederick Taylor, who took his practices from the factory, they were translated into the office, where humans were regarded as fungible, replaceable at the bottom, and organized as factory resources. Does this sound familiar, I wonder? The ideology still runs deep in how we operate knowledge workers even today across all industries, government, education, and healthcare. I can't tell you of the conversations I've had with healthcare workers recently who have been treated this way, even in the teeth of COVID-19. You might even know this from your own current experience as a project manager. Rather than having time to work on an innovative new breakthrough way of delivering something that satisfies the client needs, are you measured by how well you submit your reports, how well events are meeting your plan, etc., etc.? I think we need to review what our best contribution is. When I was recruited as into a senior management position as head of software development in a local authority, this is going back to the mid-1980s. I'm sorry if this sounds like ancient history. As I tell it, it probably is. I did not have email, but I did dictate on a voice recorder like this my correspondence, which was sent to the typing pool, group of about half a dozen, all women. And then they got dedicated word processors. The first computers as such that were introduced, apart from my Apple Mac II, they were dedicated word processors, not networked. And they did have such things as autocorrect, the spell checking. So the typist, I remember, had great fun in running everybody's name through the spell checker. Patrick Mayfield came out as putrid muffled. And I would introduce myself on the dictaphone as putrid here, and I would dictate my next letter. But then, of course, came the PC, not networked, and it was a shiny new object, and within it were further software shiny new objects, like a word processing program. And we deluded ourselves that because we were software engineers, we needed to be experts in this. So we spent time in producing our own correspondence, which wasn't a particularly high leverage use of our time. I left that organization, but I don't think the typing pool survived long after I left. I think desk work at the present looks more like this. Transactional roles of clerks were ripe for automation. These roles were quickly made redundant. In recent years, we've even seen an erosion of what we used to call knowledge work. The next organization I worked with in the mid-90s was British Telecom Yellow Pages, in fact, early 90s to mid-90s. Yellow Pages was then a book the size that thick of classified printed advertising. You would get a volume plopped on your doorstep every year, and it was of great value. Where is it now? I left BT Yellow Pages in '96 to form my own business practice, and the company that would ultimately kill Yellow Pages hadn't even been formed, which was Google. We don't need printed classified advertising anymore. We can just search for what we want. My contention is that the creative innovators, the positive outliers, never will be replaced unless the prevailing organization work culture neuters us as positive outliers by its industrial paradigm. It applies false measures of productivity to us that distract rather than enhance the high order value of work that we should be doing. So let's recap. We've looked at the fear of AI's ascendance from our skewed attention, our misinformed, unrecognized narratives through entertainment, and our faulty view of risk. And we've looked at the clues the positive outliers give us in terms of their self-awareness, self-management, and their own biased action, as well as their value in desk work. Let's turn now to what kind of hope we might have in this new age of AI. We need to be careful here when we talk about hope, because there's a lot of bogus hope around. This is classically illustrated by this man, Admiral James Stockdale. Some of you will have heard of him. There is such a thing as irrational optimism, blind optimism, which eventually harms us. The picture on the left is of the Admiral as he was captured by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War after he was shot down from his reconnaissance mission over North Vietnam. He was shot down, he was beaten up, and he was interned into what was ironically called by the Americans the Hanoi Hilton. And there he was regularly tortured and beaten multiple times over the 7 years he was in that place. He was interviewed later about his experience by Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great. And Collins asked him who didn't survive. And Stockdale was immediate and warm in his response. He said, "Oh, that's easy, the optimists. They were the ones who said, we will get out by Christmas. Christmas came and went. Then they said, we will get out by Easter. Easter came and went. Then Thanksgiving, then Christmas again. Eventually eroding all hope from these people, and they gave up the will to live. Sometimes just died. And they lowered the morale of the people around them." But Stockdale said it was those of us who were able to face the brutal reality, the way things were, and yet, despite that, find something within themselves to hope, to choose to hope. The killer question for us all tonight is there something in you and me that AI can never replace? What if there is something essentially human in what we bring to our work that no AI will ever be able to replicate? It may be difficult to conceive of that in the wake of extraordinary advances in AI right now, but could we identify this? I think given that we know so little about ourselves, I think there is an opportunity there. It's rather than being awed by technology, it's being awed by ourselves. Could we identify this? If we could, would it be of value to our clients, our employers, a future project? This then is the challenge for us all tonight. It's not a technological one. It's not about assessing the potential of this particular algorithm to replace us or that. First, it is the need for all of us to become more self-aware of our own narratives, of what we actually bring to the party that's really good, and of the social narratives within which we work, our employers' narrative about our value. And aware enough at least to know what cannot be automated about you and me. And secondly, it's to choose our internal narrative. What am I saying? What's the story I'm telling myself about me and my work? In fact, it's realizing that we can choose to become powerful. The clarity of that shifting in our mindset. about the future and about it being a choice within ourselves. Stockdale, in extreme deprivation, chose to be a survivor. Knowing that we have a choice moves us from being a pawn or a victim to becoming powerful, an actor, a protagonist, a hero even. But the third thing is to take small steps, safe to fail actions, which help us step into those positive narratives, those positive mindsets. And with practice, I've seen these become habitual. They become just what we do. So in closing, my main point is this: the future belongs not to machines, but to the creative innovators. And if we choose to be so, all of us are creative. And have you abandoned and replaced limiting narratives? If you abandon the idea of external threats from whatever source and begin to work on yourself, and I have some resources. If you head over to my website and subscribe to my blog, download one of the freebies, I will be releasing resources in the near future around this particular topic. If we choose our internal narrative, we can make AI serve us. In closing then, I want to return to Gary Kasparov. This is him today, older and wiser, and like a true positive outlier, he reflected deeply on his defeat by Deep Blue. Didn't give up. One of the conclusions he came to was that 99% of chess is tactical. It's a pattern of moves, and humans and computers can remember those. Only computers are much better at doing that. But he maintains that 1% of it is strategy. Now, I don't know if those numbers are correct, but that's the way he puts it. And it's strategy that's irreplaceable. So he began to work with what came to be called centaur teams, humans and computers working together to play the best possible chess games. And what happened was that the best supercomputer AI programs since then, the successors to Deep Blue, have been defeated by centaur teams formed by Kasparov and others, human and computer, each doing what they did best. And I submit that's an encouragement for us all. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much indeed, Patrick. Lots of interesting stuff there. I'd like to feel that I personally am an optimist about the future. But when I look at the way the education system works, in the sense that the majority of people are not really taught to think in school, they're just taught to survive in life. And it can be a learned experience being able to think, but I'm sure a lot of people don't. So what's your message for improving on that? I mean, I know you say it's, it's something that in principle we could all do, but, I'm not convinced that it's an easy task, that one.
No, I agree. And any of us who've had to lead projects which involve any behavioral change will recognize that. I think the first thing is to show up as a model. You've got to be extraordinary.
Right.
One of the reasons I chose the term positive outliers is it was based on the work of Jerry and Monique Sternin, also from Vietnam, but going a little bit after the war, post-war Vietnam in 1990, where they were trying to help the Vietnamese with child malnutrition. And the Vietnamese simply wanted food supplies because they came as representatives of the Save the Children Fund. For all kinds of reasons, and they couldn't do that. But what they could do was within the Vietnamese villages, they found women who were nurturing their kids in an extraordinary non-cultural way, and these kids were surviving. So they got these women to teach the other women. They created cookery classes, and all the other villagers visited these cookery villages. We were inspired by that story because it turned around the rates of child mortality through malnutrition in Vietnam over a 6-month period. And it was all done by the example of people within Vietnam themselves. It was not by a consultant like you or me coming along with our flip chart and telling people how to do things. So the first thing is we've got to model it. That gives people hope.
Right. Just very quickly to the audience, please feel free to raise any questions or comments that you'd like. I can't see anything there at the moment, but please feel free to do so. It's a good opportunity to get some insights from Patrick. I would like to make another comment while I'm waiting for response. In March 2021, New York police have acquired a robotic police dog. I don't know if you heard about that story, but you know, even our dogs are being replaced.
It's a bit rough, isn't it?
Even our thinking dogs, yeah. But seriously, the robotics, you know, with AI in them, is moving into every sphere of life, and unfortunately, it seems to me that we're not good enough at training those devices. You know, we're learning as we're going along, and possibly we're like the those doctors, you know, who with belief persistence that you mentioned earlier. And I think that's going to be a great hindrance, it seems to me, to us really taking AI on board as a world, really. Too much of that's going on. We know how difficult it is to manage a change program. You know, lots and lots of resistance to change just because it's change. And I think it's going to be an uphill struggle, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there are so many dimensions to this, but I think our work will change because of AI. We will become more like Centaur teams. We will be getting the best out of AI.
Right. I mean, I'm struggling to read that comment there. Would you like to take it and pass it across to Patrick?
Sure, yes. Larger impact on society, that's one of the questions raised. That's what it says. Can't see the name, but yeah. What's the larger impact of AI on society?
What's the largest impact?
Yeah.
I don't know, but what I do know is if we do not go into this with a growth mindset, we are much more vulnerable to a more miserable life.
So
you all know what a growth mindset is.
Okay.
You know, this is the idea that you and I can learn, we can grow, we can improve.
Okay.
And there's data there for this. Every decade, average IQ in countries all over the world increases by several points. Why? I don't know, but it is. And it's evidence that there is such a thing as a growth mindset, that humans can improve.
We've got to be optimistic, haven't we, that's going to happen. Otherwise,
we don't have to be, we have a choice. There's a lovely comment there from my friend Jeroen from the Netherlands. Everybody gets opportunities, but pessimists don't dare grab them. Optimists do, and that makes them great. But be realistic and evaluate the risks if it will burn your hands. Yeah, I totally agree with that. There's no got to. That's the language of victims. And I think this is one of the things in education. It does start back there. There is a serious problem with the factory template of education at the moment. I heard an example, I'm not sure where this school is, but it takes 7 to 17-year-olds, and there are 2 adults in the school population of about 120. And the only rule is that nobody can teach a child except another child. And every week, the children's projects are assessed, and they get reports every week, and they are sent to their parents, and they're getting some outstanding results. And it's also challenging an atomized view of the learning, that it's all about what I learn or what you learn. Actually, there's a collaborative sense, there's a social and community sense in which we can learn and gain. And it's really exciting.
Yeah,
So I was going to say that I mean, if we're thinking specifically about AI, then we've got to have some people who are stimulated by it, who feel positive about it and have some ideas about where it's going, to be within each of these communities. So, you know, it's a trickle-down thing, isn't it? But to be honest, although AI has been around for a long time and talked about for a long time, you know, since the days of Isaac Asimov even, you know, so, you know, it's just going to take a long time, and perhaps we need a more proactive approach to distilling that and passing that message on, really. I'm sure this computer society has a part to play, and we do actually have an AI specialist group. So although I've not been involved with them, I'm hoping that that's the sort of thing that they're trying to engender, for instance. Right, we're getting 1 or 2 comments in, aren't we, Amit?
there are questions as well. I think about a couple of questions. So there's a similar question. Well, everyone gets opportunities, but pessimists don't dare to grab them. Optimists do, and that makes them great. But be realistic and evaluate the risk. It will burn your hands, as you were confirming earlier. This was asked by Jerome. Apologies if I mispronounced your name.
I did. You probably didn't hear it because you were studying the questions, but I did pick that one out myself and answer it.
Okay. Right. Well, let's move on to the next one, shall we? From Anis Hassan. I was neutral on the voting. My biggest concern with AI is the security around this, cyber and other misuse that would have larger impact on society. So I don't know if you want to. Is that the security, presumably, on making things safe? Do you think?
Well, it's interesting. There was an announcement today by Apple of a new product called Apple Tag. And it's supposed to be something that can locate your devices for you if they get lost or stolen. But also there's all kinds of uses. People could stalk you with them. Apple's given a lot of thought about this. You could even drop one in someone's bag and it could follow them. So when I talked about there being 2 cognitive layers of understanding the world, the empirical reality and the narratives, there is actually a 3rd level. I didn't want to make it too complex, which is virtue. It's around challenging businesses to be honest and reputable and to put other stakeholders first rather than their shareholders.
Well, there's a comment here. In fact, the next one up is the one from Nirankush Das. What are your views on how we ensure ethics are upheld? I mean, this is something it very much interests me, in as much as possible when applying AI going forward.
That's a great question. That is a really great question, and it takes this debate much broader than AI, of course. It takes it into the whole attention economy and so forth. I would say it's about shining a light on these issues. It's about making them publicly a discussion. I saw a clip recently of Mark Zuckerberg attending some Senate hearing, and the senator asked Mr. Zuckerberg, Would you mind telling us which hotel you stayed at last night? And what are the top telephone numbers in your phone at the moment? And of course, he wouldn't give them that information. But the point was well made that some of these social media organizations no longer act in our interests. They are there to drive up their shareholder economic value through the attention economy. And the privacy of our information is a casualty of that. So I think instances like that, where we shine a light on the darkness of some of these practices, is the best way to do it. But this isn't a moral preach. I mean, I'm a great advocate that you don't do business without virtue. You don't leave love at the door. You don't leave concern for your customers behind. There have been, as well as Frederick Taylor, the economist, I forget his name, the one who said that the only reason that business exists is to maximize shareholder economic value. I forget his name. But that has reaped such havoc in capitalism. It's been terrible. And now this isn't an ideological point of view. This is something we all suffer from. It's distorting. And some of the best businesses invert that. They don't care about the stock exchange or Wall Street. They put their employees and their customers first. That's virtue in action. And it's about leaders being aware of that. It's about who you show up as in different situations. That's part of being the model.
Yeah. I think there are various committees around that are trying to look at how we bring ethics into AI. And I think what we're going to end up is a two-tier system. One set of ethics for running a normal business. But when you come to nations and how they deal with things, like on the military side, their ethics, I'm sure, has been abandoned, you know, with drones going in and killing, you know, ordinary folk rather than the enemy. We know already that that there's no control. And the idea that, you know, from Asimov, that, you know, a robot can't harm a human, that's already way out of date now. So
it's funny. I've got a funny story around that, actually.
Yeah, how do you rein it in, Patrick?
This is fundamentally a moral issue. And it's not about shaming people. It's about showing up with light, with daring to be scrupulous, daring to be courageous, daring to be loving, daring to be other-centered, and just not letting economic drivers squeeze you into its own mold. And it will require people to be courageous. But one of the exciting things now is we are seeing some big financial concerns all across the world quaking in their boots. And some original entrepreneurs are beginning to make headway, and they are developing a customer loyalty that's to be envied because they are displaying these ethics.
It's ironic, isn't it, that social media is good and evil. You know, it's allowing evil to happen, but it's also highlighting where good things are happening as well. So I think a lot of people will take note of, you know, where organisations are working for the good of the rather than ending. So
yeah, sorry, I was interrupting you there, Dave.
No.
But it's a bigger subject than we can deal with here. But part of the behaviour trait of being self-led actually means saying no to some of this stuff. And the fear of missing out is a victim bias. It is, I mean, I don't use Facebook now. I don't use Instagram. And I don't pay my TV license anymore. That's shocking to some people.
They'll catch up with you, Patrick.
This is not being broadcast, is it? But by excluding certain things from my life, I am freer and more powerful. A lot of people don't behave that way. They have other models in their lives. We are seeing now an interruption and distraction in our focus that's unprecedented in human history. So one of the first things a positive outlier does is to attend to that distraction, both emotional and informational.
Right, we've got one or two things that we can raise with you here. I'll move on to Ashok Sinal. He basically saying, as far as project managers and knowledge workers are concerned, how do we get them trained into outlying thinking techniques? And can you give some examples? I'm putting you on the spot there, really.
Well, I understand what you're asking, Ashok. Again, I come back to the point that you can't make other people do anything. This is part of the education conundrum. What you can do is you can invite them into thinking differently. You can begin to challenge some of their presuppositions, some of the constraints that they operate under. I think one of the biggest challenges for knowledge workers is the organizations they work within, the social narratives that the organization employs. One of my good friends in my mastermind group, in fact, works for a university as a educationalist, she provides education solutions. And the kind of contract that she has with the former boss was frightful. It was more about showing up, doing the hours, producing the reports. This lady is an absolute genius. She can innovate and bring such great solutions. What's stopping her is the mindset of her employer, who happens to be a university. You'd have thought to be more enlightened around not being subject to the industrial mindset would be a university, but not so. They're more pressured than most. So it's not a total solution to be self-led. We've also got to begin to challenge some of the ideological narratives behind some of our schools, universities, hospitals, surgeries. And that's going to be hard. I think, though, coming back directly to what you're saying, Ashok, is it's better if the knowledge worker themselves is asking that question. Because I'm a great believer in seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. And one of the best techniques is a creative unblocking technique called morning pages, where you just get it all down on the page. And you begin to get clarity about what's really frustrating you in your work, what you're neglecting, what you can turn to.
Comment by Alan Dean. Motivate tomorrow's adults today. Change starts in school. So it's more to do with policies around education and motivating the future generation to how to take AI forward.
Yeah, big shout out to Alan there. Alan is someone who's leading the education group in something called the Pivot Project around, is it COP21, Alan? I'm not sure, but around the Global Climate Initiative. And I am seeing through Alan his ability to mobilize kids all over the world, including the West, including in Vietnam, India, Australia, other places, by just doing this, having the humility to ask kids, what do you think? What could you do? Rather than shame and pronounce judgment on adults, ask kids, what could you do today that will make a difference? And yet, I agree, Alan, it does start. If you can start as early as possible, then it becomes an incurable disease of becoming a positive outlier.
I wonder actually, Patrick, how much the lockdown and children having to be taught in a different way now can be possibly making a bit of a difference in this area. Parents doing it instead of the teachers, just a different angle on things.
from talking with parents, I'm finding very, very different stories. Some kids are really excelling. Others, it's so tough, and it's even tougher for the parents.
Yeah.
I have, at the last census, I have 8 grandchildren, and I can tell you that we're seeing varied stories among my children about my grandchildren. Yeah, and it comes back to the idea that you can't apply a process in education and expect everybody to come out at the end of the conveyor belt all the same. It's just nonsense. Every child needs to be treated differently.
Yeah, I think you know, your children presumably can share stories about how the good news and the bad news, and hopefully there's some improvement due for the ones that perhaps where the story isn't so great. Anyway,
yeah, they can, but there are so many variables in education. It's not just age, it's the school that they are going into. But yeah, a classic case in point is a granddaughter who's got an excellent school in Worthing, and she's on the autistic spectrum, and she's doing great. She is loving it, and she's gone back to school, and she's doing really well. And you know, just cheer on educators who've done that, but also their mum and dad, because it does take a whole village to raise a child.
Yes.
What we've done is we've tried to, in our culture, export the education job to others.
Yeah, delegation. Oh, thank goodness I've got rid of that. Somebody else is going to do it. Yeah. Yeah, a good project manager does that, you know, but they delegate hoping that the person will do at least as good a job as they could. That's the real trick of a project manager, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, one of the next
comments. I think the best kind of project manager is somebody who identifies one of these bright spots among their stakeholders and showcases them and stands back. That's when change really takes off.
Well, you get the best out of people that way as well, don't you?
Yeah.
Peter Gross's comment here is really saying, how do we get the big potential improvements in the project management domain? So,
that's a great question. I'm not actually a practicing project manager now, but I would think that there is an awful lot of grunge work that we would look to AI to really delegate to. I think it might give us better risk assessment.
Yeah.
It also might identify some key stakeholders that we hadn't known about. It might also help us with recruitment. Again, I think we suffered too much from looking at recruitment of resources rather than unique individuals who can bring something remarkable to our projects.
Speaking about recruitment, I remember I was a recruitment consultant, a graduate recruitment coordinator in one of my past lives. And since then, I've come across this thing called unconscious bias, you know, where you reject applicants for some spurious reason, really. And I would have thought an AI model would be less biased as long as it's programmed in the right sort of way. So I'm sure you're right. In recruitment, it could be quite useful.
And I think it's better done as a centaur recruitment. You know, the best recruiter around, but they get the AI to do some of the legwork, and then both come back to you as the potential employer and say, look, we've qualified this shortlist, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so you've still got human input to make sure that there are no daft things get through. Because that's one of the worries, isn't it, about AI at the moment? It's a bit like driverless cars crashing and killing people, yeah? You know, there's always lots of worries there, and you need sometimes an override to make sure.
I'm wondering how many cars were damaged or even destroyed with people in them when the first automatic car washes came through. Because I found myself the other day, after months of not having my car washed, sitting in this car wash, thinking about that very thing, David. We think nothing of it now. We think nothing of it.
Yeah, you just have to remember to put the windows up, yeah? Apart from that, there's nothing much else to do.
That's right.
Yeah. I've got, next comment here is from Alexander Mahi. I don't know if you can read it yourself, Patrick, but I recently took part in a Microsoft AA Fundamentals course for fun, he says, and was astonished by the amount of automation. It is the way forward. We must embrace the changes and introduce it into our work and home lives, but it's challenging.
Yeah.
It's happening.
One of my favorite podcasters as a writer is a lady called Joanna Penn. She writes Penn. She writes she has a podcast called The Creative Pen. She's a great advocate. She's an optimist regarding AI. And she's a fiction writer, and she used AI to generate, she used GPT-3 in fact, to generate fantasy worlds and fantasy characters. Now, she found the process quite tedious and hard, but recognized that it gave her insight. So I think one of the things we've got to be careful about with using AI is not so much the threat of AI as the myth that it will take away all drudgery from us. It won't, but the drudgery will change because it will be around qualifying and getting the machine to produce better results for us.
Yes, we might get fed up with some of the responses that AI gives us as well. The more they think and analyze themselves, the more they perhaps challenge some of the things that we might have done. So, you know, there's quite a lot hidden there, really. I've got,
Penny.
yeah, Penny's left, doesn't she?
Yeah, she's left.
Oh, that's a shame. She's someone else I know. Yeah.
Love this way of thinking, Patrick. I've just started reading The Wisdom of Ancient People. Started an MA in theology for fun, and
Brilliant.
she's finding it fascinating so far. Lots of different perspectives, ethics and anthropology are all part of it too. So I think she enjoyed the talk.
Yeah. I think the problem is more on the human side than the AI side. We are not as advanced in our myths and narratives as we think. The story around 2001 Space Odyssey is an interesting case in point because it was a long movie. It was about 2 hours, 47 minutes, and it's quite slow by today's standards. And it was released in the days when they would have an intermission in the middle. The story goes that Arthur C. Clarke came out of the auditorium during the intermission. Sorry, not Arthur C. Clarke. Asimov came out fuming that they've broken the first law of robotics. You know, this computer has broken the first. And his friend said, well, strike him down with lightning, Isaac. You know, in other words, we begin to put ourselves in the place of gods. Yeah.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, right from the beginning, yes. They got it wrong. So it will continue that way forever, I suspect. People taking advantage of it when it suits them. The next comment here is from, sorry if I mispronounce it, Retselitsitso Motsurning. My apologies to you, but let's read the comment. Thanks, Patrick, for insightful presentation. Can I confirm that I heard you well when you say computer was once defeated, which means that there is hope that AI at one point will be less effective and efficient than people? Is it what you mean by that comparison, that the computer was once defeated? Please clarify. My initial reaction is AI will always be ahead. Therefore, it's highly likely that it will make me redundant. Oh dear.
Okay. My point was not that humans were on the ropes at one point in the form of Garry Kasparov, but then had a resurgence and finally defeated forever this damned AI. Now, the point was that the computer on its own was defeated, that there is a future for us that is a superior future if we work with AI in tandem. There is a role for AI. It always will be, and it always will be better at certain things than we are. But let's not underplay our value. That was my point.
Right. Next point here is from Jerome again. So what do you prefer, a personal guard at your house or a proper security system in your house, detecting burglary, fire alarm, and water leakage? The system I have makes me feel secure, even if I am sleeping, better than a human guard at home. What do you say to that?
I'd certainly go for your solution, Jerome, every time. Yeah.
Yeah, unless someone has messed up the programs inside the system.
But here's the thing again. I think there could come a time when we might expect AI to begin to police against hacking and do it so much better.
Yeah, we're
does
hopeful
require
about
that layer of virtue on top.
Right. Yeah, that'll gain a lot more confidence, won't it, from people if they understand that that has been happening. I think one of the problems with the using the modeling techniques to decide A-level results, I think one of the problems with that being ditched, even though the model itself was probably quite reasonable, was that people weren't understanding what they were doing, and they didn't realize they could change the parameters to fit what the public reaction was. So that's an example of where really we haven't understood it or advertised it in the right sort of way. And I think the PR for AI needs to be improved, I think, don't you?
Yeah, and it would be an easier sell if we trusted people.
Yeah.
If they modeled that kind of ethical integrity.
Yeah.
There's
right,
moving
on to
from, yeah.
No, I was going to say Richard Lawton one's here.
Hi, Richard. Hi. Good to see you, or good to read you.
Right.
AI is a very fluid concept, and there are some tasks, e.g. image analysis, that AI currently does very well, but not at all. Where do you imagine AI will be in, say, 10 years? I have no idea. It's already beyond what I could have conceived and imagined. But I'll tell you this, GPT has got an astonishing storage. It's got an astonishing storage. But neuroscientists, I think the theory on this is also very fluid about our understanding of our own capacities. But neuroscientists back in the 1990s began to revise what they thought the informational capacity, the pure informational capacity was of the human brain. And they realized that we don't store information in the brain cells so much as we do in the synaptic roots that link between cells. And they worked it out mathematically, and the number of items, of bits, if you will, of information they maintained at the time in a human brain was more than the known atoms in the universe at that time. So I think it's time for us to reappraise our own potential. I don't think we have yet conceived of the capacity of a human being. All our focus is on AI. And I think if we are to push against structural victimhood in our work, or even in our non-work because of technology, we've got to show up as the amazing creatures we really are.
I remember a Star Trek episode where Spock's brain was enhanced. So it was using what was in his brain, but it was empowering him. And I think he ended up doing, oh no, it was Dr. what's his name? And so he did a brain operation with this enhanced information. So it seems that, you know, really there is a lot of potential, a lot more potential for enhancing our abilities. And enable us to keep up with the robots, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
A comment from Terry Fried. It seems to me that AI is pattern matching. I'm sure there's a lot of it in there. What do you think? Has you come across this comment?
I'm not really qualified to answer. I feel I need to apologize for the members of the audience who are involved in AI development. As you probably gathered by now, I'm not, never have been. So I really don't know. But that's all that I've been able to recognize so far. But then, actually, in terms of neurological sense making, most of human sense making is pattern recognition. We don't make sense of what we immediately see in terms of individual items. It's usually patterns as well. So I suppose the algorithms are built in an understanding, conscious or otherwise, of how we make sense of the world.
Because that's quite a controversial area anyway now, isn't it? But with computers using pattern recognition on individuals to identify them, that's happening quite a lot, it seems now.
Again, we come back to the ethical issue here. How is that going to be used?
Yeah. And sometimes they get it wrong. Next one from Alan Dean, who's actually left now. AI has a male bias. What do you reckon? I've seen some female robots, haven't you?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll say this about GoToWebinar. It's a great tool, but I would have hoped I could have had a discussion with the audience so I could ask for clarification on some of these questions.
Yes, I agree. Right, the next one is a comment here. Shall I read it out? Comment on recruitment.
Yeah.
Prospective job seekers are often advised to tune CVs to cater to applicant tracking systems in order to have any hope of making it past the door.
All right, so it's already a reality in a sense.
I know. I feel this is one of those cases where humans tend to fine-tune themselves to suit the half-baked AI. ATS should be far better tuned to understanding CVs rather than the other way around.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We shouldn't have to conform to and stoop to what machines can understand. But at the same time, I think it's helpful if in recruitment, when we go after jobs, we understand and shape our CVs according to what people are looking for. The discussion I often have with people is that the CV itself is a summary of very rich experience that you and I bring. So if we had our own AI program, it might be able to track and enrich our CV as we go through our career.
Yeah, I know that Google and other search engines out there are looking for keywords all the time, and I suppose we're trying to bring that up in our CVs as well, aren't we? In order for people to notice us. Some people get it wrong, unfortunately, and they miss out on a job that really they would have been, able to carry out. The pity. Next one from Peter Gross. Who polices the police? That police the police? I think I've heard that before. We have this in human governance, but what about AI?
Yeah, great question. Great question. I think there has to be some kind of independent scrutiny, but yeah, that's the best I can say, really. As long as there are people who act with what in other times in history might be regarded as sociopathic intent, any technology is going to be a danger.
Yeah. Well, one of the areas that potentially the BCS could work on is acting as a sort of quality reviewer of some of the AI systems that are around, not getting involved in trying to write them themselves, but actually acting as an arbiter in some way. And I think there's a lot of potential there, not just for BCS to do that, but we need some ethical oversight, don't we? And maybe that's something we need to work hard on. Given some
BCS
of the
can be
things
part of
we
the
see.
governance, yes.
Yes. But governments are biased, aren't they? So some
Well,
things
it's
they would
interesting.
work hard on, and some they wouldn't, you know?
It's interesting to me, some people would regard blockchain as an early version of AI. And there are announcements at the moment by central banks all over the world to bring in their own cryptocurrencies. Now, some might react that that in itself is a desire for central banks to control our lives.
Yeah, everyone's got a power lust, haven't they? People who've got lots of money want even more money.
As a generalization, that's an ideology.
Works for some, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Another
I
point
like
from
the statistic. Sorry?
No, I was going to say, I was just going to bring this other point up about which Hollywood movie featuring any AI element do you believe is the most likely to be realized, and when?
Well, it's interesting that I heard that most of the technologies in Star Trek have been realized apart from the transporter thing, you know, what's it called, the when you beam me up, Scotty, that thing, that hasn't been realized, but everything else has, including the cellular phones, etc. I actually am quite a fan of the Expanse on Amazon Prime. It's about a couple of 100 years' time. It's still based in the solar system for the most part, but you're getting all of the human dramas being played out and all the tribalism. And I don't see technology there as having particular sway over humans, but it is used malevolently by humans against humans.
Right.
I think all of these movies, we have to be skeptical with them because there's dystopia in them somewhere. If everybody lived happily ever after, we wouldn't go and watch them.
I've got another comment from Peter Gross here. Jeff Bezos is a big Star Trek fan and apparently appeared in one of the movies. That's where he got all his ideas from, maybe, yeah?
Possibly. Yeah.
Well, at least some of these science fiction programs give us food for thought, don't they? And they also they can be stimulating if you can transport yourself away to a dystopian or non-dystopian world.
Yes. Yes.
Right. I can see we're coming up to. Sorry, Patrick.
There is a really good comment. Well, not that they aren't all good, but there's one I would like to respond to by that Reselicito Motsu.
Yeah.
In my view, the new COVID-19 world seems to be encouraging the use of, I think it means AI, as it's a way that encourages less contact with almost everything to avoid contracting the virus, thus empowering AI and increasing the chances of humans being redundant. Is my observation correct? I think this also relates to the current concern that in the UK, track and trace, for example, is the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of total monitoring by the state. And I do think we have to have a care with that. I think not for nothing has literature like 1984 been written. We need to understand that information is power, but it can be power that's used for good as well as for evil. I think it's opening up some interesting debates. You're right that that COVID-19 now is beginning to identify tracking systems and solutions that AI will bring in very clearly. Vaccines are using AI, or pharmaceuticals are using AI to generate some provisional vaccines that can be tested. And so it is a brave new world. We've got to be careful that it's not going to brutalize us in the end, but serve us.
Patrick, I think that's a really good note to finish on. I hope we all agree that it's been a very stimulating discussion. So thanks very much indeed. I'm sure there's plenty more that we could talk about, and maybe we'll get you back again if you don't mind sometime in the future, and do AI phase 2 and discuss some of the other areas that we haven't had a chance to really cover today. So I'd just like to, on behalf of everybody here, Patrick, I'd like to thank you really very much for what you've done today, and wish everybody a good evening for the rest of the evening. So
Thank you, Patrick.
thanks very much, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, everybody.